The wind howled through the desolate Montana mountains like a beast set loose from the heavens, clawing at the snow and hurling it in blinding waves across the frozen land. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with grief, and beneath it trudged a lone figure. Eliza Mayfield, a young woman wrapped in rags too thin for the storm. Her boots, cracked and worn through, sank deep into the snowdrifts, each step a battle against exhaustion. In her trembling arms, wrapped in a frayed blanket, she carried a bundle that no longer stirred. Her baby Sarah had been born in the wilderness just 3 weeks before. Tiny, perfect and far too fragile for a world so cruel. Fever had taken her quickly, before Eliza could even understand what was happening. Now, as she stumbled through the endless white, her only thought was to find someone, anyone, who could help her give her child a resting place before the earth froze too hard to break. Eliza's lips were cracked and bleeding, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps that turned to frost as soon as they left her mouth. She could hardly remember how long she'd been walking. Her husband, Thomas, had died 2 weeks earlier after a bandit attack shattered their wagon. The others in their party had scattered, some killed, others fleeing for their lives. When she woke up alone beside her husband's body, she had gathered what little food she could and wrapped Sarah close against her chest, praying she could find a settlement before the storm claimed them too. But God had been silent. Now, her mind floated between numbness and despair. She whispered lullabies to the still bundle in her arms, her voice breaking. "Hush now, baby girl. Mama's here. Just a little farther, my love." Her words vanished into the storm, unheard. At last, through the wall of snow, she saw it, a thin trail of smoke rising from beyond a ridge. Her heart lurched painfully. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. She pressed forward, crawling on hands and knees when her legs could no longer hold her. The trees thinned as she crested the hill, and there it was. A small log cabin, half buried in snow, with light flickering through its single window. The sight nearly undid her. Her vision blurred as tears stung her eyes, freezing on her lashes. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone, strangled by cold and grief. Step by step, she made her way to the door, the wind cutting through her bones. When she reached it, she didn't even have the strength to knock. Her knees gave way, and she fell forward, clutching the bundle close one last time before darkness crept in. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then the door creaked open. A shadow filled the doorway, a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a beard as wild as the mountain wind. He held a rifle in his gloved hands, his eyes wary and cold. At first, he thought the figure in the snow was just another dead traveler, another body the mountain would soon claim. But then he saw her face, pale as the moon, lips blue, lashes dusted with frost. And in her arms he noticed the small, motionless form wrapped in cloth. The man, Jonas Creed, lowered his rifle. Something flickered in his chest, something he thought long dead, pity or perhaps recognition. Eliza stirred faintly, her cracked lips moving. Her voice was a whisper carried on the wind, barely audible. "Please," she breathed, eyes fluttering open to meet his. "Please, sir, help me." "Bury her." Jonas froze, the words slicing through him like a blade. In that moment, as the storm raged around them, two souls, both broken by loss, stood at the threshold of fate. Neither knew it yet, but this chance encounter, born of grief and snow and desperate mercy, would change both their lives forever. And as Jonas bent down to lift the woman and her child from the snow, the first faint glimmer of something long forgotten stirred in his heart. Hope. Jonas Creed had lived alone in the Montana wilderness for nearly 8 years, and he had come to believe that silence was the only companion he could trust. The mountains, with their brutal winters and merciless beauty, had become his fortress, a place to bury the man he once was. But when he opened his cabin door that morning and saw the woman half buried in the snow, clutching a lifeless child, the walls around his heart began to tremble. He moved slowly, rifle still in hand, scanning the tree line. He knew these mountains too well. Desperation often hid danger. But there was no trap here, no ambush waiting. just a young woman on the edge of death. Jonas knelt beside her, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Her skin was white as ash, her lips blue. When he brushed her shoulder, she stirred weakly, whispering words that would haunt him long after. "Please, help me bury her." For a moment, Jonas couldn't breathe. Her tone wasn't pleading for her own life, only for the child's. He stared at the bundle in her arms and felt an old pain tighten his chest. Memories he'd buried deep clawed their way up. The fever that had taken his own little girl years ago. The night he'd dug her grave alone under a moonless sky. Without another word, Jonas slid his arms beneath the woman and lifted her easily, surprised at how light she was, little more than bone and sorrow. The small body wrapped in the blanket rested between them, and for an instant he felt the world spin as past and present collided. He carried them both inside, shutting the door against the screaming wind. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and pine. Jonas laid the woman gently on his bed, covering her with a fur blanket. He set the child's bundle on the table near the fire, then crouched beside the hearth to stoke the flames higher. The woman murmured in her sleep, her face twitching with pain, and he realized she was feverish. He poured a cup of hot water from the kettle and dribbled a few drops past her lips. "Drink," he said quietly, his voice gravelly from disuse. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and full of fear. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're safe," he replied after a pause. "You're in my cabin. Storm's still bad outside." Her gaze shifted to the small wrapped form on the table. The grief in her eyes was so raw, Jonas had to look away. "I just wanted," she began, her voice cracking, "to give her rest before the ground froze." Jonas didn't answer. He stood, turning to the corner where his tools hung. The truth was, the ground was frozen solid, but he'd dig anyway. He had to, for her. For the little one. For the ghost of his own child. He found his shovel and stepped toward the door. "Rest," he said quietly. "I'll see to her grave." The woman tried to rise, panic flooding her face. "No, please, I have to be there." Jonas studied her a long moment, then nodded once. "Then you'll need to eat something first." He ladled stew from the pot into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. She took it with shaking hands, whispering, "Thank you." He didn't reply. He just turned to the table, unwrapped the blanket enough to see the tiny face beneath, peaceful, delicate, untouched by the storm. His throat tightened. Jonas Creed had buried a child before. He knew the silence that followed death, the ache that never eased. But as he wrapped the child again and stepped out into the snow with shovel in hand, he felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the pain. A faint, aching sense of purpose. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the storm had eased. The stranger, the woman with eyes full of sorrow, would never know it. But the moment she had knocked on his door, Jonas's long-dead heart had begun to beat again. Dawn crept slowly over the mountains, its pale light spilling across a world blanketed in snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind an almost sacred stillness. Every branch glittered with frost. Every breath of wind sounded like a prayer whispered by the earth itself. In that silence, Jonas Creed stood with a shovel in his hands, his breath rising in clouds of mist as he struck the frozen ground. Each swing of the shovel was a battle. The earth was hard as stone, frozen deep beneath layers of snow and ice. Still, he dug, slowly, painfully, because he'd promised the woman inside his cabin that he would. And more than that, because he couldn't bear to see another child denied a proper rest. Inside, Eliza Mayfield sat by the fire, her face pale but resolute. She had fed on a few spoonfuls of stew that Jonas had insisted she eat, though the taste of food barely touched her grief. Her baby, Sarah, lay in the small wooden box Jonas had made overnight from pine boards. The smell of the wood filled the cabin, fresh, clean, alive, so unlike the stillness of death it would soon cradle. Jonas had said little while building it. His hands were steady, but his eyes distant, haunted. Eliza had watched him carve the edges smooth, line the inside with a strip of her torn shawl, and close the lid gently as if he feared to wake the child. She had seen men act kind before, but never with such quiet reverence. Now, as the sun touched the treetops, Jonas appeared in the doorway, snow clinging to his coat and beard. "It's ready," he said simply. Eliza wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and rose to her feet. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to walk to the table where her daughter lay. With trembling hands, she traced Sarah's tiny face one last time through the cloth. "Mama's here, my little one," she whispered. "We're going to lay you where the angels can find you." Jonas took the small box and stepped outside, waiting for her to follow. The air bit through her thin clothes, but she didn't flinch. Each step through the snow felt heavier than the last. A few yards from the cabin, near a stand of tall pines, a narrow hole had been dug into the frozen earth. The sight of it made Eliza's knees weaken, but Jonas caught her arm, steadying her without a word. They knelt together in the snow. Eliza bowed her head and began to hum softly, a lullaby her mother used to sing. Her voice wavered, but she sang on, tears freezing on her cheeks. Jonas removed his hat, lowering his head. For a long moment, there were no sounds except the wind and her song. When the lullaby ended, Eliza whispered a prayer. "Lord, take her where I can't follow yet. Keep her warm. Keep her safe." Her voice broke. Jonas's jaw tightened, and he closed the lid on the little box, his rough hands trembling just slightly. Then he began to cover the grave, each shovel of snow and soil falling softly, like a benediction. When it was done, Eliza placed a small wooden cross, made from 2 twigs tied with a strip of her shawl, at the head of the grave. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had turned inward, frozen deep where they could never thaw. Jonas stood silently beside her, his breath slow and even. He didn't speak. There were no words in any language that could fill such silence. At last, Eliza turned to him. Her voice was small, almost lost in the wind. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to help me." Jonas looked down at her, his blue eyes shadowed by pain and memory. "No one should have to do that alone," he said. They walked back to the cabin in silence. Inside, Eliza sank onto the chair by the fire, her body exhausted but her spirit strangely lighter. She had laid her child to rest, and though grief still consumed her, a tiny part of her heart had begun to heal. Outside, Jonas stood by the door, staring at the small grave under the pine trees. The snow was falling again, soft, silent, endless. He whispered something only the mountains could hear. "Rest easy, little one." Then he went back inside, closing the door gently behind him, knowing, though he couldn't yet admit it, that something had changed forever. The days that followed the burial moved slowly, like a stream trapped beneath ice. The world outside was still locked in winter, the snow lying deep and the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Inside the cabin, the fire burned constantly, filling the small space with warmth and the faint scent of pine resin. Eliza Mayfield spent most of her time sitting by that fire, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the flames as though they might answer the questions that tore through her heart. Jonas Creed moved quietly around her, his presence steady but distant. He was a man of few words, his life reduced to the rhythms of survival, chopping wood, melting snow for water, tending the fire, and checking his traps. He didn't ask about her past or pry into her pain. He seemed to understand that grief spoke its own language, one best met with silence. Each morning, Eliza would wake to find a cup of hot coffee waiting for her on the table, and the fire already burning strong. Sometimes Jonas left a piece of cornbread beside it, or a bowl of stew made from rabbit and wild onions. She never asked how he managed to find food in a world so frozen. It seemed almost miraculous. But she always whispered a soft, "Thank you." And though he never responded, she noticed the faintest nod of acknowledgement before he disappeared back into the woods. The first time she tried to help, she nearly collapsed. Her body was weak from hunger and grief, her hands trembling as she tried to sweep the floor. Jonas stopped her gently, his rough hand catching hers. "You'll make yourself sick," he said quietly. "Rest a few more days." His voice was low, rasped by years of solitude, yet there was a kindness beneath it she hadn't expected. When the snow eased enough to see sunlight, Eliza began to regain her strength. She moved carefully around the cabin, folding blankets, mending tears in old clothes, and cleaning dishes left to dust. She found a strange comfort in having tasks to do. It filled the empty hours that might otherwise drown her. Jonas didn't stop her this time. He seemed to understand that work was the only thing that kept her from thinking too much about the grave beneath the pines. At night, when the wind rose and howled against the windows, they shared the silence by the fire. Sometimes Jonas would read from an old, worn Bible, his deep voice steady and reverent. Eliza would listen, her head bowed, her heart aching at the sound of the familiar verses. She had lost her faith somewhere between her husband's death and her child's, but hearing Jonas read stirred something faint and fragile within her, a reminder that perhaps faith wasn't always loud or grand, but quiet and enduring, like the man himself. Gradually, she began to ask questions about him. "Why do you live up here alone?" she asked one evening as snow drifted outside. Jonas hesitated before answering. "World's quieter here, easier to breathe." She didn't press him further, but she noticed the flicker of sadness in his eyes whenever he stared too long into the fire. There were ghosts in his past, too. She could feel it. The weight of unspoken sorrow that hung around him like a shadow. In turn, she began to share pieces of her own story, how she and Thomas had dreamed of starting a farm out west, how their wagon train was ambushed, how she'd lost everything except her child. She told him she used to sing while she worked, that Sarah always smiled when she heard her voice. Jonas said nothing, but the next night, while she washed the dishes, she heard him humming quietly, a rough, broken tune, but it made her smile for the first time in weeks. In that quiet mountain cabin, two broken souls began to orbit each other, never close enough to touch, but near enough to feel the warmth of the other's fire. The days remained hard, the nights long, but a fragile peace had begun to take root between them, delicate as spring grass pushing through the snow, and though Eliza could not yet name it, something in her heart had begun to thaw. Winter struck again without warning. One moment the sky was pale and still, the next it darkened to bruised gray, and a furious blizzard rolled down from the peaks like an army of ghosts. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the cabin walls, and covering every trace of the world outside. Snow piled against the windows, thick and blinding, sealing Jonas Creed and Eliza Mayfield inside as if the mountains themselves had decided to cage them together. By nightfall, the storm was a living thing, raging, relentless, clawing at the door as if it meant to tear it off its hinges. Jonas moved quickly, bringing in more firewood, checking the shutters, and lashing the door closed with thick rope. Eliza helped where she could, but the wind kept stealing her breath, the cold biting through her clothes like knives. When Jonas finally forced the door shut for the last time, he turned to find her shaking violently, her face pale and lips blue. Without hesitation, he pulled a thick fur blanket from the wall and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Sit close to the fire," he said gruffly, kneeling to stoke the flames higher. Eliza obeyed, her hands extended toward the heat, trembling not just from the cold but from something deeper, a fear of being trapped again, of facing yet another storm she couldn't escape. The walls creaked as if the cabin itself groaned under the storm's weight. Hours passed, the wind screaming like a chorus of lost souls. Jonas set a pot of stew on the fire, the smell of meat and herbs filling the cabin. He glanced at Eliza from time to time. She was staring into the flames, her expression far away. He knew that look. It was the same one he'd worn for years, when the past clawed its way back through silence. He broke the stillness first. "You holding up?" Eliza blinked, startled by his voice. "I've lived through worse," she said softly, though the tremor in her tone betrayed her. Jonas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Storm'll pass. They always do." She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Not all of them." He didn't answer, and the silence that followed was heavy. The fire crackled, throwing warm light across their faces. Outside, the wind howled so fiercely that it felt like the mountain itself was wailing in grief. After a while, Eliza's composure broke. Her shoulders began to shake and her breath hitched. She covered her face with her hands and whispered through her tears, "Why would God take her from me?" "What kind of mercy is that?" Jonas froze. He hadn't heard a prayer spoken in his cabin in years. Guilt and anger flashed through him like lightning. He wanted to tell her he didn't have an answer, that he'd asked the same question 1,000 times when death came for his own little girl. Instead, he rose and went to her, crouching beside the chair. "Eliza," he said quietly, his voice rough but gentle. "Sometimes God doesn't speak through miracles or angels. Sometimes he sends someone else to stand with you in the dark until the storm passes." Her tear-streaked face lifted to meet his eyes, searching for truth in them. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing not just a mountain man, but a man carrying his own cross of loss and loneliness. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the roar of the storm and the beating of their hearts beneath the silence. Later that night, as the winds continued to rage, Jonas read softly from his old Bible, his voice low and even. Eliza listened, leaning against the wall, her eyes closed, letting the sound of his words calm her trembling soul. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace settled between them, born of shared pain, unspoken faith, and the quiet understanding that neither of them was truly alone anymore. When dawn came, the storm had left a world buried in snow. The mountains stood still, silver and silent, like a cathedral of ice. Eliza opened her eyes to the pale light and saw Jonas asleep in the chair beside the dying fire. For the first time since her child's death, she didn't feel the ache of despair quite as sharply. The storm had passed, but in its fury, it had forged something fragile and new between them. Trust. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world reborn. The air was sharp and still, the snow glittering under the early light like crushed glass scattered across the mountains. The silence was almost holy. Inside the cabin, Eliza Mayfield awoke to find Jonas already outside, cutting wood, his breath rising in white plumes. She watched him through the frost-blurred window. Each swing of his axe was deliberate, powerful, and lonely. Over the past days, something between them had shifted. The walls of grief that had separated them were beginning to crack. Eliza no longer felt like a stranger in the cabin. She moved about it quietly, mending clothes, sweeping floors, and even humming sometimes as she worked. Yet for all the small peace they shared, Jonas remained a mystery, steady and kind, but always distant. His eyes often drifting toward the mountains as though something there still held him prisoner. That morning, while sweeping, she found something wedged beneath the edge of his bed. A small, worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but the faces were clear enough. A woman and a little girl, both smiling. Eliza froze, her breath catching. The child looked no more than 5, with wild curls and eyes that mirrored Jonas's. Her hands trembled as she placed the photograph back, realizing suddenly that the quiet sorrow in him was not just habit, it was heartbreak. When Jonas returned, his shoulders dusted with snow, she met him at the door. "Jonas," she began carefully, I found your picture." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." He stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing slightly, then softening as he understood. He walked past her, set his axe down, and took a long breath. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You'd have found it sooner or later." Eliza hesitated. "She was your daughter?" Jonas nodded, his jaw tightening. "Her name was Mary. My wife was Anna." He sat heavily by the fire, staring into the flames. "I came home from the war in '66, thinking I'd left all the death behind. Found my home burned, my wife sick with fever. I buried them both within a week." His voice was flat, but the pain beneath it ran deep. Eliza sat across from him, silent, her heart aching. She understood now. The solitude, the silence, the way he moved through life like a man half buried in his own grave. "I tried to go back east," he continued after a long pause. "But everywhere I went, I saw them. The noise, the people, it all felt wrong. So I came here, built this cabin. Figured if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe the ghosts would stop talking." Eliza's eyes glistened. Did they? He gave a small, bitter smile. No, you can't outrun what's inside you. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. For the first time, Jonas seemed smaller somehow, not the unshakable mountain man she had thought him to be, but human, fragile and tired. Eliza reached for the pot of stew warming by the fire and ladled 2 bowls. Then maybe, she said softly, you just need someone to listen when they do. Jonas looked at her, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. You've been through your own hell, he murmured. Yes, she admitted, her voice trembling. And I thought it broke me. But you gave me a place to remember her, to grieve without being swallowed by it. You may think you're hiding from the world, Jonas Creed, but you've saved a piece of it. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he reached for the photograph and placed it gently on the mantel above the fire. If I saved anything, he said quietly, it's because someone came knocking when I'd stopped listening. That night, they didn't talk much more. But Eliza noticed the way he left the lamp burning longer than usual, and how his Bible lay open beside the photograph before he went to bed. For the first time in years, Jonas Creed had shared his truth, and in doing so, the cabin that had long been a place of ghosts began to feel, at last, like a home for the living. When spring came to the mountains, it arrived slowly, timid at first, as though afraid to disturb the long silence of winter. The snow receded in patches, revealing brown earth and the faintest blush of green beneath. Streams began to flow again, whispering through the valleys, and the air, once sharp and punishing, softened with the scent of thawing pine and damp soil. For Eliza Mayfield, it was the first season in months that didn't feel like morning. She could walk without her breath turning to frost, could feel the warmth of the sun against her skin. And yet, with every new morning came a growing ache, the knowledge that she could not stay in Jonas Creed's cabin forever. In the months since the storm, the two had fallen into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Each day began with quiet work, Jonas tending to his traps, Eliza gathering water, mending clothes, and cooking what little they had. There were no grand conversations, no promises, just the easy companionship of 2 people who had both known loss too deeply to waste words. But as the snow melted, reality began to creep in. Eliza had to think beyond survival. She couldn't live off the kindness of a man who had already given her so much. She needed to find her own place, her own life, somewhere she could work, earn her keep, and perhaps one day learn to smile again without guilt. That morning, as the sun filtered through the pines, she told Jonas her decision. I need to leave, she said quietly, folding a blanket and setting it on the chair. Jonas stopped stacking wood and turned slowly toward her. Leave. She nodded, her heart hammering. You've done more for me than I could ever repay. But I can't keep depending on your mercy. There's a town south of here, Ash Hollow. Maybe they need a hand at the inn or the bakery. I can work. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're sure? Eliza forced herself to meet his eyes. Yes, I have to. Jonas didn't argue. He simply nodded once and turned back to his work. But the silence that followed was heavier than any storm they had weathered together. That night, as the fire burned low, Jonas took something from the shelf, a small hand-carved wooden cross. He'd made it weeks ago, shaping it carefully from the same pine that grew near the grave of her child. The edges were smooth, the surface polished. He held it out to her. I made this, he said softly, from the same wood I used for Sarah's grave. So you'll remember she's not alone. Eliza's breath caught. She took the cross in trembling hands, tears filling her eyes. Jonas, I can't. Take it, he interrupted gently. You gave her peace. You deserve to have some too. She didn't speak after that. Words felt too small for the weight of what he had given her, not just the cross, but shelter, food, safety, and a reason to keep breathing. The next morning, she packed what little she had, a small satchel of clothes, a piece of bread, and the wooden cross. Jonas saddled a horse for her without a word. The world was awake around them, the air bright, the forest alive with birdsong. When she turned to say goodbye, Jonas's eyes were steady but filled with something she couldn't name. "You'll find what you're looking for," he said quietly. "I already did," she whispered. Then she mounted the horse and rode down the mountain trail, her hair catching the light of the morning sun. The air smelled of pine and freedom, but her heart felt heavy with longing. She looked back once, just once, and saw Jonas standing by the cabin, his figure small against the vast wilderness. He raised a hand in farewell. Eliza pressed the wooden cross to her chest and whispered, "Goodbye, Jonas Creed." The mountains echoed her words softly back to her, as if they, too, were reluctant to let her go. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew that something had been left behind in that quiet valley, something neither time nor distance could ever bury. The mountain trail was crueler than Eliza remembered. The snow had melted into slush, and the paths were muddy and uneven, winding through steep ridges and dark valleys where the sunlight rarely reached. The world beyond Jonas Creed's cabin no longer felt like salvation. It felt like exile. Still, she pressed on, clutching the reins of the borrowed horse and the small wooden cross that hung from a string around her neck. Her heart warred between gratitude and sorrow. She had come so far from the broken woman who had begged a stranger to bury her child. Jonas had given her warmth, shelter, and something even deeper, faith in life again. But she had left his cabin because she feared what staying might mean. She wasn't sure if it was love she felt for him or simply the comfort of a kind soul who had steadied her when she'd fallen apart. And yet the memory of his eyes, steady, blue, unspoken, haunted her with every step. The journey downhill was long. After 2 days, she reached a narrow stretch of forest where the wind whispered through the trees like a warning. Her provisions were nearly gone, and her strength waned. That night she made camp beneath a ridge, the horse tied nearby, the small fire she managed to spark barely keeping the chill away. But peace was not meant for her yet. Near midnight, a rustle broke through the dark, too heavy to be the wind. Eliza froze. Her heart pounded as 2 glowing eyes appeared from the tree line. Then another pair. Wolves! The horse reared and screamed, breaking free of the rope. Eliza scrambled to grab a burning stick from the fire, waving it wildly. "Go!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The wolves circled, teeth glinting in the firelight, their growls deep and rumbling. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a rock, and fell hard into the mud. The fire sputtered, dying to embers. Panic flooded her, a snarl split the night, and then a shot rang out. One wolf yelped and collapsed. The others scattered into the shadows with furious cries. Smoke from a rifle drifted through the air, and Eliza looked up to see a tall figure striding toward her, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. "Jonas," she breathed, disbelief trembling in her voice. He knelt beside her, checking her arm for wounds. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "What are you doing here?" "Following you," he said simply, his voice low and rough. "Didn't trust the road. You're not ready to face this world alone." Anger and relief collided in her chest. "You had no right," she said, trying to stand. "You don't get to decide that." Jonas met her gaze evenly. "Maybe not. But I know what it's like to lose everyone and walk into the dark thinking you're strong enough to live with the ghosts. You're not running toward life, Eliza. You're running from it." His words hit harder than the cold wind. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, she knew he wasn't. The strength she'd been clinging to was built on fear, not freedom. For a long time, they stood in silence, the fire's glow flickering between them. Finally, Eliza whispered, "I don't know where I belong anymore." Jonas sighed, his breath fogging in the air. "Then come back," he said softly, "until you figure it out." Something in his voice, gentle, sure, patient, broke the last of her resistance. She lowered her head and nodded. By dawn, they were riding side by side, back toward the mountains. The world felt different now, less like a trap, more like a promise. The sun rose behind them, painting the sky in gold and rose. When the cabin came into view again, Eliza felt tears blur her sight. She hadn't just returned to a shelter of wood and stone. She had returned to the one place that had taught her the hardest truth of all. Sometimes, you must leave something behind to understand where you truly belong. And as Jonas helped her down from the saddle, his steady hand finding hers, she realized that the road back wasn't just a journey through the mountains, it was a journey back to hope. When Eliza crossed the threshold of Jonas Creed's cabin once more, it felt entirely different from the first time she had stumbled there, half dead and begging for mercy. Then it had been a refuge for survival. Now it was a sanctuary for the living. The walls, the fire, even the smell of pine and smoke felt like an embrace. Jonas didn't speak much that first day after they returned. He moved through his chores as though nothing had changed, feeding the horses, splitting wood, boiling water for tea. But the air between them had softened, no longer taut with unspoken pain. When their eyes met, there was a quiet understanding. She had left, and he had followed, not out of pity, but out of something deeper neither dared to name yet. Eliza spent her mornings outside now, gathering herbs, mending the small garden Jonas had long neglected. The earth was rich and damp beneath her fingers. Each seed she pressed into the soil felt like a promise that things once broken could grow again. Sometimes Jonas would join her, kneeling beside her in silence, helping to dig. Once she looked up and caught him watching her, not with sorrow this time, but with something like peace. "You've brought life back to this place," he said quietly. Eliza smiled faintly, brushing dirt from her hands. No, the life was already here. It just needed someone to see it again. It was during one of those soft mornings that she began to hum. A simple tune, something her mother had sung long ago when the world was kinder. The melody floated through the air, light and unforced. Jonas stopped working, listening. The sound was fragile, but it carried warmth like sunlight through the trees. When she realized he was listening, Eliza blushed and turned away. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "It's an old habit. For the baby, I used to sing to her when she couldn't sleep." Jonas said nothing for a moment, then reached over and gently touched her wrist. "Don't stop. She'd want you to keep singing." The words struck her like a blessing. For so long, she had avoided anything that reminded her of her child. Songs, laughter, tenderness. They hurt too much. But now, as the tune rose again, the ache in her chest didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a memory being turned into love. Days slipped into weeks, and the rhythm of their lives deepened. Jonas began carving again. Small things at first, spoons and handles, then figures of animals and trees. Eliza noticed one day that he was shaping something new, a woman holding a child. He didn't explain it, but she knew. It was her and her daughter, carved from the same pine that had sheltered them. One evening, a storm rolled through, not fierce like the winter one, but steady and cleansing. The rain drummed on the roof, and thunder echoed through the valley. They sat by the fire, their chairs close, the warmth wrapping around them. "Do you ever think," Eliza asked softly, "that God sends people to us when we need them most?" Jonas gazed into the flames. "I used to think he'd forgotten me," he said. "After Anna and Mary, I stopped talking to him. But maybe he was waiting for you to come knocking." Eliza smiled through her tears. "And I thought I came here to bury a child." "You did," Jonas said gently. "But you also came to bury your sorrow." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with light. Jonas reached for her hand, hesitant but sure. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and in that simple gesture both understood. This was not about replacing what had been lost. It was about learning to live again, to carry the love that remained forward. Outside, the rain softened into mist. Inside, two broken souls sat side by side, not healed entirely, but healing. And for the first time since grief had stolen their voices, both whispered a silent prayer of thanks, not for miracles, but for each other. The summer sun crept gently over the mountain ridge, spilling golden light across the valley. Dew clung to the grass like pearls, and the world seemed to hum with quiet life. Birds flitted between the trees. The river murmured softly nearby and in the distance. A soft plume of smoke rose from the chimney of Jonas Creed's cabin. Once a place of solitude, now a home filled with warmth and purpose. Eliza stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, watching the light spill over the peaks. The wooden cross Jonas had carved for her daughter hung on the wall above the mantel, surrounded by wildflowers she picked every Sunday morning. Beneath it, a small wooden carving, Jonas's latest work, rested on the table. A mother, a child, and a man standing behind them, steady and strong. It had been nearly a year since she had first knocked on his door, broken by grief and desperation. Sometimes it still didn't feel real. How could a life so full of pain have turned into something this gentle? Jonas entered quietly, his boots soft against the floor. He was carrying a basket of eggs from the hens out back, his hair streaked with silver and his face touched by the early sun. "You're up early," he said with a half-smile. Eliza turned, her eyes soft. "Couldn't sleep." "The world felt too quiet," he chuckled. "That's a first. You used to jump every time the wind moved the shutters?" She smiled faintly, setting the mug down. "Maybe I've grown used to it." "Maybe I've grown used to you." Jonas didn't answer right away. He set the basket down and moved closer, his gaze steady but tender. "You've changed this place, Eliza. I didn't think it could feel alive again." "You didn't just give me a home, Jonas," she whispered. "You gave me back the part of myself I thought I'd buried with her." He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his calloused hand trembling just slightly. "And you gave me back something I didn't think I'd ever have again, hope." Outside, the world continued to wake. The sound of a horse approaching broke the moment. Jonas stepped to the door, squinting into the sunlight. A rider appeared on the trail, Sheriff Dalton, an old acquaintance who occasionally checked on Jonas since the war. He dismounted, tipping his hat. "Morning, Creed. Ma'am." He nodded toward Eliza with polite respect. "Heard there's a new teacher needed down at Ash Hollow. The school burned down last winter, but they're rebuilding. Figured I'd mention it since someone said you used to teach letters to children." Eliza blinked, surprised. "I did," she said softly. "Back home before?" Her voice trailed off. Dalton smiled kindly. "Well, seems the mountains ain't the only ones in need of rebuilding. If you're looking for work, they'd be glad to have someone like you." After he left, the cabin was quiet again. Eliza turned to Jonas. "Maybe it's time," she said, "to teach again, to help others the way you helped me." Jonas studied her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then you should go. You were meant to give life, Eliza, one way or another." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't born of grief. They were full of light. "Will you come with me?" she asked softly. Jonas hesitated only a moment. "I reckon the world's big enough for both of us." "Wherever you go, I'll be there." The afternoon sun spilled across the cabin as they packed what little they had: books, carved keepsakes, and the wooden cross. When they rode down the trail together, the wind carried the scent of pine and promise. The same mountains that had once witnessed her despair now bore witness to her rebirth. Eliza looked back one last time at the cabin, her voice barely above a whisper. "Goodbye, old ghosts." Jonas took her hand as the horse carried them forward. "No," he said quietly. "Not goodbye. Just the beginning." And with that, the mountains faded behind them, and a new life, built on sorrow, grace, and the quiet power of love, began.